In this video, I want to offer a brief introduction to the prophets. In the coming days, I'll be examining those books that are traditionally classified as prophetic books, at least according to the way they are arranged in the English Bible. We'll begin with the prophet Isaiah. But before we begin with Isaiah, I think it's best if we start off with an initial question, a question that you may be wondering about. The question is this: what was a prophet? Well, John Walton and Andrew Hill, in their Old Testament survey textbook, they offer a good definition of what a prophet was. They say that a prophet was someone who speaks on behalf of another person. Specifically, with respect to the Old Testament, a prophet was someone who was called out by God to speak to people on behalf of God. This prophet was charged to speak whatever God told them to speak. They were to make the desires, plans, purposes, and the will of God known to the people. When it comes to the Old Testament, a person might notice certain distinctive characteristics that exist within the different ministries of the different prophets depicted there. And so there are different ways, in other words, one might classify prophecy in the Old Testament. For example, Walton and Hill note that a person could divide the ministry of the prophets in the Old Testament into two categories, one being pre-classical prophecy, the second being classical prophecy. Examples they list for pre-classical prophecy are prophets like Moses, Deborah, Samuel, Nathan, Elijah, and Elisha. And examples of classical prophecy would be Isaiah, Hosea, Jeremiah, and so forth. So one big difference that could be observed between pre-classical prophets and classical prophets, according to Walton and Hill, is that pre-classical prophets focused their prophetic utterances mostly upon the rulers of the nation at the time, that is, upon the king and his court. Classical prophecy, on the other hand, focused their utterances mostly upon the people of the nation as a whole. I mean, there are, of course, exceptions to this. However, this is just a general rule that I think is well noted. Additionally, as Walton and Hill point out in their book, it is the classical prophets like Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Hosea, etc., that had their oracles written down and codified into what we now have as their books. By contrast, the prophetic ministries of, say, Elijah and Elisha, while those are documented in the Old Testament text, they were not written down as separate pieces of literature or codified into books. Although one might say that Moses is an exception of this as a pre-classical prophet whose works were codified into books. But his work, specifically the Torah, is going to be classified differently than quote-unquote prophetic literature, strictly speaking. So maybe he's not an exception. All right, so another way to classify the prophets that might be more familiar to you is the well-known twofold division of major prophets on the one hand and minor prophets on the other hand. The so-called major prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, although it's interesting to note that in the Hebrew Bible, Daniel is not classified under the prophetic portion of the Old Testament text. Daniel is classified as part of the writings. Okay, the so-called minor prophets are Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Here's the deal. The way of describing the prophets into major and minor categories, as major prophets on the one hand and minor prophets on the other hand, that way of describing them, in my mind, is not helpful. The reason is because they tend to take on qualitative significance when you use those terms. In other words, these descriptions tend to make it sound as if the most important, i.e. major prophets, are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, while the least important, or the minor prophets, are Hosea, Joel, Amos, etc. But the fact of the matter is that all of the prophetic writings in the Old Testament hold great weight and significance. In other words, there are no minor prophets in the sense of their quality and significance to the life of Israel. So you may be asking, well, why do we call some of the prophets major prophets and some of the prophets minor prophets? Well, as I said, it has nothing to do with the substance or the quality of the respective prophets. Rather, it just has to do with their length. The major prophets are called major prophets because their books are longer than the minor prophets. So, for example, the book of Jonah is much shorter than, say, the book of Isaiah. So that's the only reason why we call Isaiah a major prophet and Jonah, for example, in books like Jonah, a minor prophet. Not because Jonah has only minor things to say in terms of quality, and Isaiah has major things to say in terms of quality. Far from it. Both are very important to the story of Israel, and in both of these books occupy a very significant place within that story. Again, the designation major prophet and the designation minor prophet only has to do with their length. So I generally try to stay away from using descriptors like major or minor when referencing the prophets. All the same, I suppose that if one were to keep in mind everything I said just a moment ago, then perhaps those terms aren't that bad. Okay. Another thing to remember. When it comes to the final 12 prophets listed in your English Old Testament, the ones that I've listed as the, quote, minor prophets, it's important to know that in the Hebrew canon, in the ancient Jewish text, these 12 books were actually considered one book, not 12 separate ones. So in that book of the 12 prophets was simply known as that, the Book of the 12, or simply the 12 for short. So that's something to keep in mind. So that's a good introduction to the classification of the prophetic books and what prophecy was, generally speaking, in the Old Testament.